Good morning, everyone. Today is Thursday, May 15th. We continue our study of Gemara, and our spring semester is a deep exploration of halachic texts on marriage and divorce. Though halachic text is probably a categorization that I'm not sure the Talmud itself would have recognized, because these genres are superimposed on what is itself a kind of uh, anthology that defies genre, where legal, that is to say, halachic texts, are intermingled with folkloric, that is to say, agadic texts. Nevertheless, our focus has been on the legal stipulations surrounding Jewish marriage and Jewish divorce. So we're now several weeks into our curriculum, and if you haven't had a chance to catch up on previous sessions, they are on this YouTube channel. So take some time to review, and that will help you understand what we're doing today, which are some odds and ends pertaining to Jewish marriage. And then we're going to take a little detour that's not really a detour. It's a brilliant modern feminist critique of Jewish marriage, by which I mean Kiddushin, the sanctification of a woman by a man, that is enacted through the signing of a ketubah, the exchange of an item of value, customarily a ring, and the standing beneath a chuppah to symbolize the familial bond that is being forged through this ritual of union. So we're going to look at Rachel Adler's critique of Kiddushin, one of the academic viewpoints for which this marvelous living scholar of Judaism from retired but taught for many years at Hebrew Union College on the Los Angeles campus is best known. Then we're going to have an opportunity to begin our unit on divorce. So we have a lot of fun material to look at today, not all of which is Gemara, though we root ourselves in the Talmudic text. But again, there's a reason that later exegetes, no less an authority than Maimonides most prominently, were moved to codify Talmudic precepts into easier to read, much more digestible and digested codes of Jewish law, right? I'm sure you've picked up by now, even if you've only done a modicum of Gemara study, that it's not particularly digestible. It's a really unapproachable book, that is so discursive and with so many detours that sometimes become the main highways, that it's very hard to, just pick up a Talmud and say, okay, I can tell you how we practice Judaism. That's not really, I think, consistent with the aim of Talmud, and that deprives us of the fun of the exploration. Nevertheless, if you are just a Jew or Jew curious and you'd like to know, well, why do we do the things we do and what's the right way to do them? Talmud isn't a good starting place. I'm sure you've figured that out by now. So let us bless, and then we'll go right into our learning for the day. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay. So I'd like to begin with just a few comments that I actually share with every couple preparing to be married under a chuppah with me, uh, about the different categories of Jewish practice that inform the Jewish wedding ceremony. So we have seen that in biblical times, there is no rite of marriage, and I'm spelling that R-I-T-E. I suppose there's no R-I-G-H-T of marriage either. It is simply an act of possession through sexual union, by the husband of the wife. So much so that the Hebrew word for husband, Baal, also means owner or master. It's indistinguishable. There is no separate word for husband that does not mean master. It's Baal. The rabbis endeavor to build in both protections that I believe serve to benefit the bride, the woman in this arrangement, being by far the more vulnerable partner in ancient Jewish society, and that also provide a Jewish framework for acknowledging that a couple is duly joined and that they constitute a new family within the Jewish community, and that the ceremony of Kiddushin, of marriage, which also, as we have explored in some depth at this point, means sanctification, coming from Kiddush, Kodesh, the same root that means to set aside as holy, which means other or unique or in a category uh, of itself, or Duke Ellington, the great American composer, conductor, pianist, band leader, one of the most influential figures in American music, and I would argue in 20th century American art. His favorite compliment was to say that a person or some or a thing was beyond category. That's a Duke Ellington ism. So much so that there's a box set compilation of like Ellington's greatest hits across his 50-year recording career called Beyond Category. And I think there may even be a noted biography of Ellington called Beyond Category. So I think of a useful idiomatic translation of Kodesh or Kiddushin as beyond category, right? It exists in and unto itself. So when a man sets aside a woman as Kodesh through the ritual of Kiddushin, she becomes beyond category. She's a singularity unto that person, and their love is dedicated in a way that no other love will quite match. In fact, that's the whole point. You're supposed to love your spouse unlike you love everyone else. So the ritual of Kiddushin comprised, as we saw just last week, of two core components: blessing over the betrothal, and then what the Talmud calls Birkat Chatanim, which literally means the groom's blessing. We know it colloquially as Sheva Brachot, the seven benedictions, which constitute Birkat Nisuin, or the blessing of marriage. So you have betrothal, where the husband and wife, or the bride and groom, are joined with the intent to marry. Then they exchange a ring and speak some nice words. And then they are affirmed in their union through the Sheva Brachot. And we even looked at the text of those Sheva Brachot. That is the heart of the wedding ceremony uh, in all streams of Jewish life. This coming week, a week from today, when I conduct a wedding at Mamaroneck Beach and Yacht Club, unusually on a Thursday afternoon for a wonderful couple, bride having grown up at WRT, co-officiating with my Orthodox colleague, it will follow that pattern. Though it sometimes surprises people that when they see me solo officiate, even though I'm a Reform rabbi, many people can't tell that I'm doing a ceremony that is by a Reform rabbi, because there's nothing particularly Reform about it. I'm using the standard language. I may add more commentary in. I may be a little bit fast and loose with the order of the service. Generally, though, it is a strict Jewish wedding through and through with those core components: the blessing of betrothal, the exchange of rings and vow, the Sheva Brachot to affirm the union. I did mention last time as well that originally scholars have deduced that the wedding was actual, that these two components of the Jewish wedding ceremony or ritual were separate ceremonies. There was a betrothal, which happened at the time that the happy couple was introduced in an arranged marriage by the parents. And then they would come together to affirm their vows and have the Birkat Chatanim, now known as the Sheva Brachot, the seven benedictions, pronounced over them. And Orthodox custom holds that you can and should recite the Sheva Brachot in the home, the new home of the bride and groom, for 7 days following the wedding, so that it becomes kind of an antilogue to the Shiva practice around mourning. That just as when a family member dies and we grieve that person's death, we observe 7 days of homebound Jewish practice. So too, when a new family is created and a home is dedicated through Kiddushin, it is customary to dedicate 7 days in the home for the purpose of affirming their union. Those are just a few review fun facts and figures about Jewish weddings as presented in Gemara and in later Jewish practice. Um, what's interesting, perhaps, to us is that provided that you sign a ketubah, exchange an item of value, and uh, and stand beneath a chuppah, and then that's it. You've done the thing. You've fulfilled the rite of Jewish marriage. But of course, that would deprive us of all of the beautiful things that we associate, or many of the beautiful things we associate with a Jewish wedding. So you notice nowhere have I mentioned the need for a rabbi. Though that it is customary to have a rabbi, many people ask me, well, are cantors authorized to do, can they do Jewish weddings? And I think they mean may they. Of course they can. It's not the hardest thing in the world. I mean, it's a 20-minute liturgy. If you can read Hebrew, you can lead a wedding. Typically, the privilege of officiating weddings in Jewish life has fallen to clergy. That is the preferred custom, though it is not a law. And that's only because the Talmud does stipulate that a person who is versed in the rules of Jewish marriage and divorce should be the authority who solemnizes weddings. But there's no real stipulation that the rabbi or the cantor has any specific authority conveyed by the Jewish tradition or the Jewish community to solemnize weddings. If you are a learned Jew who is familiar with the liturgy, and can tell people, what's going on in the ceremony, you too can be a misader kiddushin, which literally means an organizer of the kiddushin of the wedding, or the one who orders the ritual. That's my official role, but I don't have any Jewish authority. So a marriage that is performed by a non-rabbi, if it is done according to the halacha, is a valid marriage. So you notice we didn't say rabbi standing under the chuppah, but we also didn't say things like must lift up a Kiddush cup. You infer that raising a Kiddush cup is part of the ritual because both Birkat Erusin, that is to say the betrothal blessing near the beginning of the ceremony, and Sheva Brachot include a Borei Pri Hagafen, and we unpacked that last time. Um, when you make a Kiddush, it's the wine in the cup that symbolizes joy, but you don't need a special cup for that. And that is to say, any cup can be purposed or repurposed as a Kiddush cup. So, and perhaps most prominently, you notice we have nowhere mentioned the custom of breaking a glass. And that's actually where I wanted to look today to begin, because a lot of what we do as Jews is not derived specifically from halachic rulings, that is to say, Jewish law, but rather is customary. It's just follow what the Jewish people do. You might call it custom in English. Minhag is the proper Hebrew word. Um, People who are sociologists for a living might describe Jewish folkways or traditions. All of those are valid ways of understanding that much of what we do in Jewish life is, let's call it extra halachic. Like it resides outside or adjacent to the halachic frame of Jewish practice. Um, so there are any number of minhagim that are not required by Jewish law. I did some reading up, though there is not a Gemara text to study to support this, but the custom, for instance, of what kind of ring is exchanged. Most of you are aware that the tradition is a plain band of a single precious metal. And I think I mentioned this the other week. One reason is that ostentation is discouraged in Jewish ritual practice so that it does not appear that something sacramental, kiddushin, a holy ritual, is a privilege of the wealthy. So the idea is, we talked about this when we talked about the valuation of the item that is exchanged, that it's, the more broad opinion, the more inclusive opinion is that it's worth a pruta, which is a very small denomination. The debate in the Talmud is whether it's a pruta or a dinar, which is a much larger denomination. Um, tradition favors the pruta. In other words, it's basically a Cracker Jack ring would suffice. You don't need for the item to actually cost much. But where do we get this notion that a ring must be forged of a single precious metal without ornamentation, in particular without stones inlaid on it? So a ring without bling. That custom, there are several plausible answers. The one that struck me as most plausible was that the valuation of the ring should be clearly determinate. And so if you have a single precious metal, all you need to do is weigh the ring and you know what its value is. Right? I mean, other than the labor that went into making it, but the value of a single precious metal is a fixed assigned value. However, when you start putting stuff in it, ornamentation and stones, the valuation of the item becomes more and more indeterminate and subjective. I thought that was actually a very helpful explanation, and I wish I had the text up, but my computer reset itself for a software update overnight and and erased all of my browser tabs. So I had to reconstruct those on the fly this morning, and I missed that one. But I thought I would share that with you. And now on to the breaking of the glass. So what we're looking at here is the end of Tractate Brachot in the Babylonian Talmud. This is passage 30b. So this is again one of those digressions that leads us to a main point. So you think you're going down a rabbit hole, but it turns out to be an avenue for a very significant point of Jewish practice. So the previous passage leads to a verse from Psalms that puzzles the rabbi or that gives the rabbis an opportunity to explore and expound. And that phrase is the one in quotes at the beginning of this passage that I've extracted, marked here as paragraph 20. My vigila beriada. Sorry, vigilu beriada. Sorry, I'm going to try that again and not mess up the Hebrew. My vigilu birada. What is the meaning of this strange phrase, Vegilu bir ada, which means to rejoice with trembling? Gilu means from gil, which means to shout out with joy. Bir ada means with trembling, implying fear. So it's a delicious oxymoron, literary oxymoron in the Psalms that commands that we would rejoice with trembling. What's that phrase all about? And it leads to a long rabbinic discussion that actually includes material from the previous paragraphs that we're not looking at. Amar Rav Ada bar Matna Amar Rabba. So here's the citation. Rav Ada bar Matna said in the name of Rabba, Bimekom gila sham tehe re'ada. In a place where there is joy, there should also be trembling. So this is a very interesting, broad claim about life, or perhaps about the way Jewish tradition looks at life, that there is no such thing as unadulterated, or what Steinsaltz here provides in the translation as unbridled joy. Even when there is rejoicing, there should be trembling. And that seems like a strange phrase, like you must temper joy with something anti-joy or non-joy. Though my lived experience as a rabbi, joining people in moments both happy and sad, often intended to be pinnacle moments of happiness or sadness, is that organically happiness and sadness and everything else in between are usually commingled, right? So you rarely get unadulterated joy in life. You rarely get unadulterated sorrow. Usually there is laughter at a funeral when you begin to tell stories of your loved ones that call up his or her unique personality and spirit. There's occasion for laughter, and it's actually healthy and can be cathartic along with the tears. And at weddings, often there are tears, and not only happy tears, like there are tears of Nana isn't with us today. And there are tears I think that every parent sheds over recognizing that their child is now forging a family path of his or her own, distinct from one's family of origin. So I often tell couples that for you, your wedding is kind of a win-win. You don't lose your family of origin, but you get this beautiful new person and family to call your own. For parents, it's a win-lose. Anyone who says we're not losing a son, we're gaining a daughter or a daughter-in-law is BSing you. There is a sense of loss for parents when they, not for nothing, it's called giving away your child at the chuppah, right? I'm going to give away my daughter. Well, there's something to that, I think. So this may simply be an acknowledgement of what is actually happening at the psychological level of these pinnacle moments in life that Judaism chooses to affirm through sanctified rituals more than it is a prescription. All right, so boiling down, I think that this idea of happy sad, which is a notion that is not original to me, I heard it for the first time at a sermon in Rhode Island, of all things. I was with my dad, and we heard Rabbi Larry Kushner deliver a sermon about happy sad being the baseline feeling that we all deal with every single day, that we're always walking in happy sad and learning to negotiate how those two seemingly paradoxical, non-combining experiences actually make up the richness of our lives, and that Judaism seeks to affirm that. Well, the breaking of a glass at a wedding is illustrative of this notion that we don't get unadulterated joy, and also we don't get unadulterated sorrow. And then there's always an asterisk, except when we do. I'll leave room for moments of unadulterated joy and unadulterated sorrow, but more often than not, they are commingled. So returning now to the text, um, Abaye hava yatev kame de Rabba. So Abaye, who's another Amora, a later sage of the Talmud, he would sit before his teacher, Rabbah, Chazye de Havaka Vadach Tuva. You can maybe hear that I'm in Aramaic here. It says, and he noticed that he was really, really happy, like over the top happy. Amar, he said, Vigilu birada, but the Psalms say, rejoice with trembling, Ketiv. That's what's written. So one's joy should not be unrestrained. And what is Abaye's response? Amarle, Anat filin manachna. And he says, no, it is possible, it is permissible for me to be this happy because I am wearing tefillin, and as long as my tefillin are on me, they ensure that I am actually in a state of religious reverence or awe. In other words, that's the trembling. So I'm doing this thing, I'm doing this Jewish ritual, no matter how happy I am, it is tempered by the fact that I have this like physical awareness of God's presence, which prompts a state of trembling. Okay, the text goes on. Rabbi Yirmiyah Hava Yatev Kame de Rabbi Zera. So we've got a formula now. This is exactly the same syntax and verbiage as the paragraph that came before. So Rabbi Jeremiah would sit in front of his teacher, Rabbi Zera. Chazie de Hava Kavadach Tuva. He saw that he was excessively joyful as well, Amarle, and said to him, B'chol etzev ye'em motar k'tiv. Isn't it written, in all sorrow there is profit? So he's found another verse to illustrate the same concept. Wait a minute, isn't it a good thing to be a little bit sad? You know, excessive joy seems to be viewed with some hesitancy or skepticism by the rabbis. Nobody should be totally joyful all the time. That's not Jewish. If you are so happy and you know it, clap your hands. Like, wait a minute, you're supposed to be a little bit miserable, right? Isn't and then they cite scripture to prove this stereotypical point about the Jewish people. No, wait a minute. I don't trust it's a little too happy. It's just a little too much. I remember once I interviewed for a job as the assistant rabbi. This is 5 minutes before I was ordained, so April of 2000. I interviewed for the assistant rabbi job at Temple Emmanuel in New York. And the rabbi at the time, uh, Ronnie, oh, why am I blanking on his name? Somebody in this group knows. Uh,
Sobel, Ronnie
Ronnie
Sobel.
Sobel, thank you. If I'm not mistaken, Ronnie is still among the living, though he must be very advanced into his 90s at this point. Anyway, Ronnie made a snarky reference. I asked him about how, Emmanuel views prayer and what the prayer experience is like on Shabbat, and he says, Jonathan, we don't do things the way they do up at old Happy Clappy. And that was his reference to BJ on the Upper West Side, where our current Rabbi Platkow was a fellow for 2 years. He referred to this kind of new style of lots of singing and very much like the WRT of, the last 15, 20 years as Happy Clappies. He was basically saying, we are decorous, maybe a little bit miserable when we're praying. Like we aren't happy clappy. Okay, mom and dad, your hand is raised.
I would just substitute for the phrase fear and trembling, maybe more Jewishly guilt.
Right.
There can be no total happiness because you're always feeling guilty about something.
Something. Right. This strikes me as a text that is authentic not only to Jewish text, but to the lived experience and the unique anthropological features of Jewish communities and Jewish people. Okay. So it's like, what's the deal, Rabbi? I don't like how happy you are. That strikes me as not very Jewish. And he cites another verse, this one from Proverbs, and he gives the same response. Amarle, ana tfilim manachna. I've got tefillin on me. It's okay. Now, we're getting to the point. You're like, okay, Blake, where's the broken glass coming up? Mar uh, bre de ravina avad chilula livre. Okay, so similar story. Mar, that's another Amora from the Talmud, another sage from the, I don't know, fourth or fifth century, I believe, son of Ravina, Avad Hilula Livre. A Hilula is a feast or a party for his son. In this case, it's defined as a wedding feast. So he made a wedding party for his son, and Chazan hula Rabbanan de Havo Kavada Chituva. And he saw that all the rabbis were just having the time of their lives. They were a little too happy at this wedding. Now, this is a cliffhanger because you notice we're at the end of the page, but of course, in Talmud, these page divisions are artificial. So we just go straight on to the next page. All right, so what happened? He notices all the rabbis are really kicking up their feet and just having an exuberant time at his son's wedding. Uh, Aiti casa demokra bat arba meazuzi. He brought forth a cup, a kasa, like a kos in Hebrew, kasa in Aramaic. Demokra bat arba meazuzi. A cup worth 400 zuz, of cup worth 400 zuzim. Now, if you can buy a goat for how many zuzim? Two, right? You know from Chad Gadya. You buy a goat for two zuzim. This must have been a very expensive cup. This is a cup worth 200 goats. Okay, so this is a very impressive piece of hardware. The tabar kamaihu, the vi'atzivu, and he broke it, and they became very sad. So and then there's a kind of complementary tradition. Rav Ashe avad hilula livre. So there's also a story that Rav Ashe threw a wedding feast for his son. Chazan hula rabbanan havu kabadachituva. All of the rabbis were having too good a time. They were just really killing it at this party. It was a banger. Ayati casa dizugita chivarta vitabar kamaihu vi'i atzivu. You can tell I'm a little bit more hesitant when reading Aramaic. This is definitely not my first, second, or third language, so apologies for the clunky pronunciation. He brought a cup of extremely valuable white glass. So it's a counter-prevailing tradition. It doesn't give you the exact valuation of the cup, but you get that it's an expensive item. Vitabar kamaihu, and he broke it in their presence, vi'i atzivu, and they were very, very sad. And the tradition goes on from there. But this is actually the Talmudic derivation for breaking a glass at a Jewish wedding, because unadulterated joy, not so Jewish. And in order for it to be a fully Jewish event, you need a tinge of something that causes you to tremble or feel bad, feel sad. You notice what's not here, by the way. It never says that this was done in remembrance of the destroyed temple in Jerusalem, which is the most customary association assigned to the ritual of breaking a glass at a wedding. But it is not, by any stretch of the imagination, the only acceptable or plausible explanation, which is why I usually, like most rabbis, use the breaking of the glass at the end as an opportunity to give a final drush before they go out from under the chuppah. Not a long drush. People are really cognizant at this point, 28 minutes into a wedding ceremony, that the rabbi is literally the only thing standing between them and hors d'oeuvres. So you really don't want to elongate your presence at that point. But we always end with breaking a glass, and many people don't even realize that it's not supposed to be a festive sound. It's actually anti-festive. And there's something quite beautiful and rich about it that affirms the reality of happy sad. And what I often say to couples is that, for these few minutes that you've stood under the chuppah, you've been able to visualize perfection. But now you go back out into the real world, and there's a lot of work to do out there. So let the sound of this glass remind you of the work that you'll have to do throughout your lives, or something like that. Now let's take a few comments or questions. Judy and then Joe, please.
Is it possible that in older times that there was almost a superstition? Let's not be too happy because Satan is lurking at us, and we shouldn't tempt. It's like, even I think, is there a string on a baby's crib or something? Don't be too happy. Don't rejoice. You
Right.
never
There is
know.
often a very fine, and I would say semi-permeable boundary, a semi-permeable line between minhag or custom and superstition. And I would even go farther and say, well, that's a subjective assignment, right? So what one man's minhag is another man's superstition. There are customs that Jewish people seem to favor that another Jewish person might view as abjectly superstitious, and certainly early American and early German Reform Judaism threw into the bucket of superstitions that should be discarded any number of practices that later modern today's Reform Judaism has entertained restoring to Jewish practice. So lots of things that early reformers did because they looked backward, or kind of like shtetl Judaism that was unseemly to them. They would have said, I think they even used in the Pittsburgh Platform, the kind of one of the signature documents of late 19th century classical American Reform Judaism, that many of the customs that came under the scrutiny of the Reform rabbis in America and that they recommended extirpating or shutting off to the side were relics of a superstitious age. That's a paraphrase, but the word superstition may even come up. What about breaking of the glass? Interestingly, I am not aware of any Reform rabbi, present day or previous, who treated the breaking of the glass as merely superstition and not worth carrying into a present day wedding ceremony. But again, I think that's a subjective evaluation, Judy. I certainly don't, I wouldn't feel comfortable doing a wedding without it. Though at the end of the day, I don't have a halachic grounds to stand on. If somebody says, we really don't like this glass breaking thing, the fact of the matter is it is custom, not law. It is not anywhere near the category of ring, ketubah, chuppah, which are the three essential components, without which it really isn't a Jewish wedding. Breaking a glass, it's a thing that Jewish people do, and you can see there are these folkloric traditions that reinforce perhaps why we do it, because it is intended to signal an emotional orientation to Jewish celebration, which is that joy is good, but too much joy is too much, and it needs to be tempered by non-joy or anti-joy. Um, There's something quite rich about that that I'd feel a little bit sad myself if it weren't included, which ironically would accomplish the exact aim that breaking the glass seeks to accomplish. So I guess that if we didn't break the glass and the rabbi felt sad about it, mission accomplished. And if you followed that, then you've clearly spent too much time with me. Okay, Joe Levine, you're next.
I could not help. Am I unmuted?
You are unmuted. We hear
Okay.
you.
I could not help associate the happy sad situation with sports. I remember way back when I was very young. I remember one of my I forgot which one it was. A coach said, "Stop celebrating. The game is not over." And now, when we watch a sports activity, we see people get excited over the child gets a hit, or somebody hits a home run in a major league game, or somebody scores a point and the team goes ahead. I say to myself, and I sit back on my hands, I don't clap, I don't get excited. I said, the game is not over.
Right.
There's
Anyone
good
who was
and
paying
bad to
attention to
come.
the Knicks Celtics game last night, if you turned it off
Uh,
at half, you kind of missed what it was all about.
we can talk later, but I knew the Knicks were going to lose.
Don't say it, Joe. It's a tough night for us Knicks fans. I'm a Sixers fan, so I'm totally neutral on this, but officially in my capacity as a rabbi in Scarsdale, I think I have to root for the Knicks. Um,
Talking about fandom, just real quickly, I go back to when the Knicks started in 1945, when they first became a league and then the NBA. So my fandom goes back that far.
well, you are true blue, and I love your comment, Joe, as a person who's coached more games, I'm sure, than you've lost count. Knowing that it ain't over till it's over, and that the what makes sports great, what is actually not unbroken victory, but the excitement of things changing on a dime. Let's take Ann, Russell, and Peter in that order, please. Ann, are you unmuted? You lowered your hand, but you didn't unmute.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
I'm going way back to when you started talking about Baal, meaning master and husband. Well, when I was in Israel in the 60s, not all the women went along with this Baal bit. So instead of saying Baal Shali, am I saying that right? Baal
Yep,
Shali?
yep, yep.
Instead of saying Baal Shali, they would say Ish Shali, my man.
Yes. Correct. And that there are different, we're going to look at that actually. Just hold Anne's comment in mind because it really attaches beautifully to the critical commentary we're going to look at next from Rachel Adler. I won't say more. It's perfectly in tune with what we're going to study today. Thank you. Russell, then Peter, please.
I'm interested in the word that they use for trembling. Uh, when the other Dr. Blake in my life spoke a minute ago, I think he inadvertently made a Freudian slip and said fear and trembling rather than rejoice and trembling, which of course invokes the great philosophical tract on the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And I wondered if the word trembling, as used here, is in any way related to some of the text that is used in the Akedah.
So
That would
this
be
is
a very
great.
interesting concept to raise in the context of a wedding.
It is indeed. There are two words in biblical Hebrew that denote trembling as an act of both fear, but not fear with the shading of horror, rather fear with the shading of awe. There are several words actually that connote fear with the shading of awe. I would say three of them. Yira, but then there's the word that's used here, which is ra'ada, resh ayin dalet, which means to quake. And then the other one is charada, which means to shake or tremble. And they're all kind of analogous, but they're slightly differently shaded. And they may just, ra'ada and charada might be poetically linked to each other. In other words, they might play well with each other just because they're slightly assonant, or maybe they were more assonant in the way biblical people pronounce their Hebrew. Charada is perhaps the one best known to us because it is the direct route that leads to the modern term Haredi. So literally the Haredi or the ultra-Orthodox, which is exactly how we usually translate Haredi in the Western press. So Haredi are the same as the ultra-Orthodox, in which, by the way, that's kind of a super category of lots of different sects and groups within Orthodoxy. The Haredi literally are the Jewish Quakers or the Shakers. And you can tell, like we have religious sects in America that exactly correspond to these biblical terms. I even wonder, knowing that these American religious sects of the Quakers and the Shakers, how rooted they were in the study of what they would have called the Old Testament, if they were deriving their name directly from King James' translation of the Bible. That's probably worth looking into. So in the case of the Jews, Haredi literally means those who quake or those who tremble. Again, not out of horror, but out of piety, right? They are constantly in a state of religious veneration, and therefore that causes them to quake in their piety. Um, the word in the binding of Isaac, there's no, to my, no, I know that text really well. So Genesis chapter 22 does not mention quaking or shaking or fear in any way. But Fear and Trembling is the name of the treatise that uses the Binding of Isaac as its kind of source text and jumping off point by the Danish existentialist philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, right? So
Yeah.
that's your reference point. And it's
Yeah.
so weird that you would mention that because I'm doing a wedding in a few weeks where the groom is Danish. And I asked him last night if there were any readings that he would like to incorporate into the wedding ceremony that would be meaningful for his family. And he said, yeah, there's something by Kierkegaard. I'm like, really? I'm like, I imagine it doesn't come from Fear and Trembling. And he said, no. And he said he would send it to me. So beyond that, it's been many years since I've read Fear and Trembling by Kierkegaard, but it is, one of the most influential works of 20th century existentialist philosophy. And he clearly derives the notion of fear and trembling from the Akeda story, but I'd have to go back into his text and see what he's playing with there.
Got it. Well, thank you for that. And if I may just ask a corollary question, Shomer Shabbos, is there any trembling associated with
None
joy
whatsoever.
in that?
No, interestingly enough, the modes of human, feeling or expression that are always denoted in Shmirat Shabbat or keeping Shabbos, Shomer Shabbos, are oneg and menucha. So what Shabbat is intended to induce in the person who keeps it is oneg, which means delight, or anuga, to the quality of being happy or delighted, and minucha, which means rest. But Shabbat is actually, in a way, even more perfect than the joy we experience at a wedding in that nothing is supposed to adulterate it. Right? Shabbat, you actually have to put in these which is maybe in part it corresponds to or it emphasizes why you don't do weddings on Shabbat. I mean, there are a number of halachic reasons why you're not supposed to change a person's legal status or standing in the community on the Sabbath when status changes are part of what gets restricted. But I think there's also this idea that the introduction of something jarring or fear-inducing or trembling-inducing or sad at a wedding is precisely anti-Shabbat.
So Rabbi Sobel was wrong. There is pure joy.
There is pure joy. Just visit Happy Clappy on the Upper West Side. Peter.
Well, two small things. At my daughter's wedding, I think everyone was very expectant, very excited about the moment when the glass was going to be broken. And it did seem like that was the very moment at which they became married. It seemed like that. The other thing I was going to say was that mixing joy and, well, sadness, or not quite sadness, but joy with, which is tempered, is when we're on a journey. And I don't know what your traffic is like in your country, but it can be really awful here. And you're nearly there, and my wife says, that's it, nearly there, we'll be home for tea or whatever. And I say, the very words are always the same. We're not there yet.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And yes, traffic here is enough to induce homicidal thinking. Um, so, especially if you have to do a wedding in the Hamptons and you haven't allowed 5.5 hours to drive there. The times when, as a rabbi, I have sweat bullets the most have not had anything to do with the direct act of serving the Jewish people, but rather getting to a funeral or a wedding on Long Island. Um, so what I'd like to do is jump off from here and look at a really interesting essay that was brought to my attention just yesterday by my chavruta, my study partner and mentor, rabbi and friend, Rabbi Jan Katsu, who is also our teacher. Many of you learned with Jan and Noam this winter. I'm in process of talking with Jan about a little mini course next year that we're still debating topics, but we might do something on the ethics of family life. So that would be open to the community on Zoom. Time TBD. Uh, anyway, he told me that his good friend and colleague, Rabbi Rachel Adler, who is a grew up in an ultra-Orthodox community, was married to an Orthodox rabbi, an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, and eventually broke free because she felt a calling to become a rabbi, which was, of course, a huge social taboo in that community, a thing that is not done. The wife and a mother does not include going off and becoming a rabbi of all things, and eventually was divorced, and is known as one of the, I think, most erudite thinkers in modern American Jewish life and a feminist critic of Jewish tradition. And her wealth of both expertise and insight is astonishing and worth sharing with us. So, um, she is, I would say, perhaps more than any other single subject, distinguished for her insights into Kiddushin and her critique of Kiddushin. She has written extensively about it, and this is a short form. This is like a two-page essay that encapsulates much of her thinking. So we're going to actually read it together and explore a little bit of her thinking on this. I hope that the text is big enough. I'm showing 3 columns at a time. Do you feel that you can read that with me? It's not great, right? What if I enlarge it even
Okay.
more to about 2 columns at a time? So the essay is called Critiquing and Rethinking Kiddushin, which we know is Jewish marriage. The word is out in both the diaspora and Israel. The classic form of Jewish marriage, known as Kiddushin, has problems. Critiques and remedies are present from Orthodox and non-Orthodox sources. An entire issue of Shema from June 2010, which is a journal of Jewish thought, has been devoted to rethinking Jewish weddings. So, what does she mean there's trouble with Jewish marriage or Jewish weddings? Let's find out. I'm in the leftmost column, the trouble with Kiddushin. Critics allege that the legal structure of Kiddushin is a format for inequality in the marital relationship. Wives are biblically required to be monogamous, husbands are not. We know that, by the way. So much of this, I think you'll be able to pat yourself on the back for how much you remember from the last few weeks of our study together. Kiddushin is rooted in property law. We've also acknowledged that. In the first chapter of the Talmudic tractate Kiddushin, valid methods of acquiring a wife are analogous to ways of acquiring slaves, land, animals, and other chattel. As Gail Leibovitz demonstrates in her interdisciplinary study Marriage and Metaphor from 2009, the Talmud frequently uses objectifying metaphors of owning and buying in regard to marriage. Women complain that the bride in a classical kiddushin must be passive and silent, her silence signifying consent. Remember, we talked about the last couple of weeks how when the husband betroths the wife by placing a ring on her finger, in an Orthodox ceremony, this is a key difference between what Orthodox rabbis do and what I do. And I'll tell you how we're squaring that circle, pun intended, a week from today at the marriage that I'm doing with my Orthodox co-officiant. But in a traditional Jewish wedding, an Orthodox Jewish wedding, groom puts ring on finger of bride and says, Hareyat mikudeshet li b'taba'at zo kedat Moshe v'Yisrael. Behold, thou art consecrated unto me with this ring, as my wife, in keeping with the law of Moses and Israel. Wife says nothing. She accepts the ring. So this is what Adler means when she says, is silent and silence signaling consent or complicity? Um, of course, the bride, having grown up reform in the wedding that I'm doing next week, did not want to do a non-reciprocal ring exchange, but the Orthodox rabbi would not consent to standing under a chuppah and having groom put ring on finger of bride and say the magic formula, followed by bride put ring on finger of groom and say the uh, gender syntax configured or conjugated phrase that I give brides to say to their grooms, which is standard Reform Jewish practice, which is just, behold, thou art consecrated to me as my husband. You just change, instead of hareyat mikudeshetli, you say hareyata mikudashli. Barbara's nodding because she knows Hebrew, and you're just saying what a woman would say to a man as you put a ring on the finger. That's what I do in a wedding. In this case, we squared the circle, or we came up with a very thoughtful compromise, which I think is also a testament to the flexibility that my Orthodox colleague demonstrates in this instance. He is more than willing to have the bride put the ring on the finger of the groom at the ketubah signing before we stand under the chuppah and say not the magic formula words, but rather ani lidodi vidodi li. I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. An oath formula kind of line from Song of Songs, biblical text, chapter 6, verse 3. And the bride was very satisfied with that compromise. That's just a kind of a fun aside of how in the real world we actually try to uphold both Orthodox and Reform practice and make it work, though usually, in full disclosure, I find that it is often the expectation that the Reform partner will capitulate to the wishes of the Orthodox partner because they are operating in a much stricter halachic framework, and I am operating outside of a halachic framework, and I'm okay with that. I'm cool. I get it. I'm not going to ask my Orthodox colleague to violate halakha. But I am grateful when an Orthodox colleague is willing to make accommodations so that the Reform partner in these rituals can feel affirmed, and therefore maybe the anxiety or discomfort over what Adler is pointing out is somewhat mitigated, is lessened. Okay, let's read on. Women complain that the bride in a classical Kiddushin must be passive and silent, her silence signifying consent. Furthermore, Kiddushin requires the man to acquire the woman unilaterally. Mutual acts of espousal are specifically ruled out. The preferred method of acquisition is kinyan kesef, which literally means purchase with money, buying the woman from herself with a token of easily specifiable but slight value. Grant Adler, the academic language, this is all stuff we've covered in our class. A gold ring with 18 carats engraved inside is now commonly used. In Orthodox practice, I would add. Because only a man can acquire, only the husband can renounce his acquisition. Halachically, women cannot effect their own gittin, divorces. A get being a writ of divorce, gittin, Aramaic plural for divorce. Hence, if a husband becomes mentally incapable of giving a get, or has disappeared, or simply refuses to divorce, his wife is trapped. And by the way, between this week and next week, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the case of the aguna, or the chained or trapped wife. She cannot get out of the marriage, becoming an aguna, chained woman. If she remarries, counter to halacha, her subsequent children will be stigmatized as mamzerim, ineligible to marry other Jews. The word mamzer, or mamzer, means a bastard. Okay. A lot is happening here. So the situation that Adler is describing is one of the most complex and, I would say, morally difficult, morally atrocious even, challenges within the field of strict Jewish law. That even today, ultra-Orthodox communities do not have an agreed upon halachic workaround for this problem. That if a woman is contracted to a wife again, this is in strict Orthodoxy, right? And even then there are Orthodox poskim or authorities who have ruled more leniently and have created some possible workarounds, but in the ultra-Orthodox world, there is no workaround for this. And by the way, the power establishment within ultra-Orthodox communities is complicit with this flaw in Jewish law and with the non-resolution of this flaw. Simply described, if a woman is contracted to her husband through ketubah, through a duly performed and authorized marriage, the only way out of that marriage is there are only two ways out. And we actually saw this in Mishnah Kiddushin and Gemara on Kiddushin, chapter 1 in the Mishnah, or page 2a. It's the very beginning of Tractate Kiddushin. There are three ways by which a woman can be married: through money, through a writ, ketubah, and through intercourse. That was the first thing we looked at in this unit this spring. You got to go back in your memory 4 weeks. There are two ways out of a marriage for a woman. One is through the death of the spouse, the death of the husband. The other is through a duly provided divorce or get. But what do you do if the husband, for instance, goes on a journey and disappears? Now you've got a real problem halachically, because the woman is still married to the guy, but without evidence that he has died, the woman is ineligible to remarry even after years and years and years and years. The rabbis do provide certain conditions where it will be legally assumed that the husband has died and the woman can be declared a widow, which therefore opens up the possibility that she can be remarried. But what about the case where a husband becomes sick or comatose and is on life support and remains in a perpetual vegetative state? You've got the same problem, right? You've got a woman who is chained to her disabled husband. The husband has no agency to speak for himself. He's not able to authorize a get. And in some cases, the community, the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate, will refuse to give a get or to compel a get for the wife, and therefore she cannot remarry under halachic auspices. And what Adler is saying is, were she to remarry in violation of halakha, any children she has with the new husband would be mamzerim, would be bastards, because the only legitimate children that can be produced from a union are children of a duly authorized marriage or kiddushin. You following? Any questions so far? Because there's a lot of this is very specific Jewish law. This is real world stuff here. This isn't just 2,000-year-old Talmudic dicta. Okay. So continuing on in Adler's critique. Some couples complain, I'm highlighting where I'm reading, that the Babylonian boilerplate ketubah, the writ of marriage signed by the husband, witnessed, and given to the wife does not reflect the conditions or issues of a modern marriage. So she's basically saying this custom is way outdated for today's real world. And given to the wife does not reflect. Okay, finally, although gay, lesbian, and transgender couples seek authentic Jewish ways to marry, most consider kiddushin inappropriate to their needs. I'm in the top of the second column. Tweaked kiddushin. So she's going to now propose possible remedies to the issue or the issues she has outlined in the beginning of this article. Sorry. Two of the most popular ways of remedying these problems among non-Orthodox Jews, that's a really important clause, right? Because non-Orthodox Jews are not bound by the strictures of halakha and therefore have more flexibility in Jewish practice. They still want authentic Jewish ways of observing, but they are not bound the way the ultra-Orthodox are double ring ceremonies and creative ketubot. I talked about double ring ceremonies about 20 minutes ago. So you don't need to, that's just the word for reciprocal ring exchange. And creative ketubot, in other words, a ketubah that isn't about purchase. Some of you probably have an Orthodox ketubah, meaning it's principally written in Aramaic, and it talks about a bride price and the penalties imposed upon a husband should he choose to divorce his wife, monetary penalties, which are intended to disincentivize divorce. Most of the couples, I would say 95% of the couples I marry, choose a creative ketubah. If you go to ketubah.com, which, yes, is the largest modern purveyor of ketubot, you will find many ketubot that play off the traditional formula and language, but go in a very free-form poetic direction, basically saying instead of I am responsible for food, shelter, and, satisfaction, and instead they talk about our home will be founded on love and laughter and Jewish values, and we will share the adventures of life and console each other when things get hard. That's a lovely thing for couples to sign. And again, I joyfully preside over a huge preponderance of the weddings I officiate with creative ketubot. So the kind of things Adler are talking about, but she's going to go on to say, unfortunately, such creative expressions of love, commitment, fidelity, whatever else a couple wants to affirm as they take their marriage vows, have no standing in the halachic community. Let's pause for a few comments and questions before we continue reading. Mara first, please.
Forgive me if I've forgotten the circumstance, but where is it that when the husband dies, the wife marries the husband's brother?
That is an entire tractate of Talmud and an entire field of Jewish thought known as Yivama, or levirate marriage. And that is also provided in Tractate Kiddushin. So we looked at it 4 weeks ago. No expectation that you would recall this, but in biblical practice and in early Talmudic or rabbinic law, if a woman became widowed, it would become a responsibility incumbent on the brother, or the oldest brother of the husband, the surviving kin, to take the woman in levirate marriage, and even to fulfill the mitzvah of producing offspring, which would become heirs to the dead husband's estate. In other words, you are producing heirs in the name of the deceased, given the fact that the deceased is incapacitated, dead. That practice is later ritually invalidated through a ritual known as chalitza, which involves the doffing of a shoe and the declaration of a solemn formula that basically says, although I am ritually obligated to marry this woman, being the surviving brother of my dead brother who was married to her, I renounce this responsibility, and the Jewish community assents to my renunciation of that responsibility. Carol.
I was married by a Orthodox rabbi, and I got divorced. I went to Texas to get married, and my ultra-Orthodox son said, "You have to get a get." My ex-husband is in Florida. Now, he's not coming to Texas. I'm not going to Florida. So I was divorced in front of a bet din by proxy. Orthodox. I had to go through this little ritual and was told I had to keep my get with me at all times.
So this is a good jumping off point for a story that was shared with me. Michelle, are you here today? I might wait or can I share this anonymously?
I'm here.
Didn't mean to out you.
That's all right.
Why don't we save this for next week, because we're going to do a lot more on Gittin. May I go back to the essay? No, wait, we had another couple of questions. Mom and Dad, you're next.
It's incumbent upon the husband to provide food, shelter, and sexual satisfaction. Is that the triad?
That's the triad, yep.
Well, what's the condition in which the husband can't provide one, two, or three of those things? Wouldn't he be obligated to get a get?
Yes, so it's interesting. These, I believe, were intended to provide protections to women that were previously unknown in the biblical community. Food and shelter presumably is about if the husband becomes indigent and is not willing or able to provide financially, right? These are just basic necessities. So there is no obligation in Jewish law for a woman to remain married to a man who will not or cannot provide financially, or who withholds the marital bed from his wife. Does that answer your
So
question?
she wants to get divorced because he doesn't do one, two, or three of those things,
She has
and
grounds.
he refuses to give a get. Now what?
Yes. So this is also a contributor to the modern dilemma of aguna, of chained women. There are women in ultra-Orthodox communities, as I live and breathe, like as I'm teaching today, who are chained to husbands who are in abject, incontrovertible violation of the terms of their ketubot, who refuse to give a get. Now, the way it's supposed to work is that a bet din, and this is what Carol was alluding to, a duly constituted rabbinical court, which means three duly ordained rabbis, convene to not just, they can't just issue the get, they have to compel the husband to give the wife a get. There are all sorts of things that can be done. Um, Carol, was your ex present for this ceremony?
No, I think she said. No.
Right. So in this case, he appointed an agent or was compelled to appoint an agent or a shaliach to carry out the issuance of the get. There are, however, in answer to my dad's query about a quandary, there are communities where a bet din will basically side with the husband, even in violation of the ketubah, and refuse to compel a get and leave the woman chained in what, in many instances, is an abusive marriage. So this is a huge problem of domestic abuse. Again, we're talking about relatively small numbers, but it would be a huge problem even if it were one woman who were, because of the way the Haredi community, I believe, has corrupted the intent of this set of Jewish law, allows women to be chained in abusive marriages. So the real issue is that you have a corrupt Beit Din that won't give a get. So yes, there are agunot or chained women for any number of reasons. A husband disappears but can't be declared dead even if presumed dead. A husband becomes sick and enters a persistent vegetative state where he is not dead, but the woman remains married to him and can't get a get. Or what I think are the most awful situations, these situations where the Beit Din, even if convened, sides with the abusive husband and refuses to compel the giving of a get, even when the woman has warrant for one. And these battles can grind on in the Orthodox communities, and I'm not an inside participant. So literally everything I'm sharing with you is what I know from reading. Is that a satisfactory answer? I mean, not morally satisfactory. Is it intellectually satisfactory? You understand the issue? Okay. Audrey and then Anne, please.
Okay, I just wanted to mention that my grandfather actually was the brother of a fiance who I'm told who died. So I guess that's very real. But I'm curious, where does the concept of a dowry come in?
Dowry is basically built, or a dowry or a bride price. What's called mohar ketubah or mohar kala is is stipulated in the traditional language of the ketubah itself. Um, though it is generally not paid uh, proactively, but rather imposed as a penalty upon the issuance of a get. So there's always a price to be paid, and the idea that the husband would be responsible for this bride price upon the dissolution of the marriage is one of the many disincentives to getting divorced. In other words, it's going to cost you. So the idea was that husbands would have several disincentives that were not baked into the biblical practice of just taking a wife as property and claiming her as your own, and then being equally able to just summarily dismiss her as
But
divorced.
but wasn't it expected in the past that the bride would bring with her like certain financial attributes, I guess?
I believe that there was in ancient patriarchal times a the idea of a price given to the father of the bride as a ransom. So there's a portion of money or property which a wife would bring to her husband in marriage. That's the dowry or a bride price. But unlike other nations in antiquity, in ancient Israel, the bridegroom would name this mohar and would basically negotiate with the father of the bride. If you look at this in, like, it's biblical. If you look in Genesis chapter 24, verse 12, or Exodus somewhere in chapter 22, there's a reference to this. But scholars doubt whether or not this bride price or dowry was given in the form of a ransom to the father or as a gift to the bride. And these are just biblical, and they seem to be customs that are actually obviated by the issuance of a ketubah instead. Anne? Okay, going once. Your hand is raised, but you're unmuted. Yep.
What does the mikveh have to do with all of this? Because I had an Orthodox girlfriend who, after she was married, they don't go on a honeymoon because of the laws about the mikveh.
Well, okay, so women, there's a whole tractate of Talmud governing called Nida, which governs marital purity. Right. So the idea is that in Orthodoxy, women and men separate themselves during menstruation and with a cushion of about a week. So 2 weeks of a month, men and women do not have sex. In brides and husbands and wives do not have sex because it is intended, I guess, to increase fertility by uh, conjugating when you are ovulating. Um, and that there are purity laws going all the way back to Levitical practice, the book of Leviticus, that stipulate that a woman who is menstruating is ritually impure. Any number of feminist critiques on this, by the way, but I'm not imposing I'm not evaluating this from a moral perspective. I'm just saying this is what Jewish practice stipulates. So a woman is supposed to have sex only when she's not menstruating or with a cushion of a few of days on either side. As a result, I can imagine a scenario, though I'm not familiar with one myself, that is like the one you're describing, where a woman couldn't take a honeymoon during the period of menstruation. After menstruation, women go to the mikveh and are ritually purified again. And that's how the cycle goes on. In addition, it is customary, though I'm not sure it's stipulated by Jewish law, but it is customary for brides and even grooms to visit the mikveh as a spiritual act of purification before getting married.
Yes, but also the way it was explained to me is that after after the first night of after when you're married, you usually bleed, and it has something to do with the mikvah. I don't even remember.
I'm not conversant enough in the laws of NIDA, so I'd have to do my homework on that. Obviously, so I am not sure, to be honest, if a virginal bride whose hymen is broken upon first intercourse in the marital bed on their first night of marriage then has to go to the mikveh to purify. I get where you're coming from. It sounds right to me, but I would need to actually look in my Guide to Jewish Life and Practice by the great Isaac Klein, this is my master source for preparing this curriculum for this whole course, by the way. Before I go into the Talmud, I'm reading chapters of Isaac Klein's Guide to Jewish Religious Practice. This is a must-have in your library, by the way. Still in print, absolutely essential book, not a small book, it's a pretty thick book, but it gets into the nitty-gritty of literally everything from Jewish life. I'd like to get as far as we can into the mikveh article. Into the Rachel Adler article. You're saying mikveh confused me, and I almost said Rachel Mikveh, who's another Reform rabbi, feminist critic. So this is Rachel Adler, not Rachel Mikveh. Let's go back and see what she's proposing here. We were at the idea of workarounds, or what she calls tweaking Kiddushin. One is to do a double ring exchange. So groom puts ring on finger of bride, bride puts ring on finger of groom. That's what I do at 98% of the weddings I do, not the one I'm doing next Thursday. The next area of tweaking, she proposes a creative ketubah, a creative ketubot, right? So a ketubah that's not really a ketubah. Whether it is valid for a couple to exchange rings is a matter of controversy. In other words, the word exchange implying that it's reciprocal. Both the Orthodox decisor, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and the conservative Rabbi Isaac Klein, same Isaac Klein who wrote A Guide to Jewish Life and Practice, a Guide to Jewish Religious Practice, believe that the marriage is valid once the husband has given a ring, even if the bride reciprocates with a ring and a statement. Rabbi Feinstein forbids the practice, Rabbi Klein permits it. So an Orthodox rabbi says, no, 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 no. It's not a valid marriage if the bride then says, here's a ring for you, hubby, and here's a line that I'm going to say, which is why the rabbi I'm officiating with next week, favoring this decision, said, well, no, under the chuppah, groom puts ring on finger of bride, says the magic formula, you're done. Bride will give him a ring before the ceremony. So if she wants him to wear a ring, sei gesund. But according to Jewish law, this is my wedding ring. I don't need to be wearing this. Only my wife needs to be wearing it to fulfill Jewish law. But Rabbi Klein permits it. He says, no, that is permissible. You notice, though, it doesn't say it's required. Creative ketubot written by the couple have no legal force either in Jewish or civil law. They would be superseded by the classical ketubah. Some Orthodox couples write addenda to the ketubah in a separate document, and in some cases make a neder, or a vow, about the contents of the document. Rob and Lamel Ryman published material from their kiddushin on the internet, and you can even go to journeymama.net, including a document where the husband pledges sexual fidelity, a living ketubah, I guess the idea that their ketubah is subject to revision and revisiting, and documents facilitating delivery of a get. The Orthodox rabbi Stephen Greenberg, who is gay, describes officiating at a gay marriage effected entirely by mutual vows. Some Orthodox couples are giving the bride a voice in the ceremony. In their ceremony, which you can read about in the Journal of something, journal, Doctors Beverly Gribbetts and Ed Greenstein used an ancient variant formula for acquisition. The groom said, and finally we're back to Anne's first comment from today's class from an hour ago. Behold, you are my wife, and I am your man, ishech, right? Not your owner, not your husband, I'm your man. And the bride responded, I am your wife, and you are my man. Her statement does not effectuate acquisition, but simply acknowledges his acquisition. However, it is participatory. The use of your man rather than the usual term for husband, Baal, master, owner, recalls the biblical prophet Hosea's prophecy from chapter 2, verse 16, in which the covenant marriage is reconciled. You shall call me Ishi, my man. No longer shall you call me my Baal, my owner. In other ceremonies, after the groom has pronounced the acquisition formula, the woman recites a verse from Song of Songs. That's more or less what's happening at the wedding I'm doing next week. That is ortho-reform or reformadox. She's saying, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. Okay. And the article goes on from there. I'm going to send a link to the full article in my follow-up email to the class so that you can read it on your own. The whole thing is worthwhile, but I thought that it would be interesting to see how a feminist rabbi, deeply conversant in matters of Jewish law, is able to identify those aspects of classical kiddushin, classical marriage, that are in friction or tension with the modern world and modern Jewish practice, and also some thoughtful Jewish workarounds, or what she calls tweaks, that might allow participants who are open to it to construct authentically Jewish, meaningful frames for marriage and divorce. So that's I thought that was worth looking at. questions, thoughts just on Adler? I'm going to leave that tab up so that I can remember to send it to you. And there were a number of other things that I wanted to cover today. So let me just go back to my lesson. And this is going to be, of course, in direct continuation of where we go next week. So what we're leading to is understanding that the rules of divorce are inextricably entwined with the rules of Jewish marriage, right? And in some ways, the whole idea of a get is that it is the one thing that can undo a ketubah, either that or death. And if we contrast that with biblical practice, the difference becomes immediately apparent. So the contrast is provided by looking at a couple of verses from the book of Deuteronomy. So this is the Bible's idea of divorce. Let's take a little peek here. So we're looking at chapter 24 of the book of Deuteronomy, verses 1 and 2. Ki yikach ish isha uve'allah. Wow, 4 words here, but boy, do they say a lot. 4 or 5 words. Ki yikach ish, literally when a man takes isha, a woman, uve'allah, and becomes her husband. Now that's the situation. A man takes, notice the verb is to take, not to consecrate, not to set aside as holy, but takes. A man takes a woman, uve'allah, and becomes her husband, but literally he owns her. He becomes her master. Right? That's the biblical frame. Vaya im lo timsachen be'enav. But if she no longer finds favor in his sight, right? She no longer is agreeable to him as a wife. Ki matzava ervat davar, because he finds something unseemly with her. This should trouble you, but it should also be reassuring to you to know that the Bible is not the end point of Jewish practice. The Bible is the starting point of Jewish practice. And the Bible and all of its complicated and challenging notions are the reason that the rabbis did what they did, which was modify Jewish law and say, wait a minute, this stuff is really outmoded even for us in the year 0. We're looking at a text that's hundreds of years old. It's the year 0. They wouldn't have called it that. Here we are hanging out with Jesus and his buds. And it's already apparent to us that the Torah law on divorce and marriage is not satisfactory for the world we're living in. So the Bible, however, provides only that the man finds something, they use the word obnoxious about her. Irva literally means something unseemly or naked or unattractive. It's not a good word, slippery even. I'll go on from there, but it's a word that has negative sexual connotations in the Bible that really resonate in a pretty yucky way, at least for this modern reform reader of the Bible. So that's grounds for the husband to get rid of her. So he finds something he doesn't like about her. V'chatav la sefer kritut. He writes her a scroll of literally expulsion. Here they say a bill of divorcement, but it's not the same word that the rabbis would use for divorce, which is garash or goresh, which means to divorce. This word comes from karet, which means to excommunicate or cut off. So he writes a sefer, a scroll, or we would say a book, but I don't want you to think of a book because they weren't binding books this way in antiquity. In Deuteronomic times, roughly 6-7 centuries BCE, anything that we think of as a sefer was a scroll. So he writes her a little parchment thing that says, get the hell out of here. V'natan biyada, he puts it in her hand, v'shilecha mi beito, and sends her forth from his house. And then verse 2 says, v'yatza'a mi beito, she goes forth from his house, v'halcha, she walks, she goes, v'ayta le'ish acher, and gets with another man. All right, she gets with another guy. It says she belongs to another man. So again, you notice that there's no ritual of marriage, there's no blessings, there's no kiddushin. She just leaves she's divorced, she leaves, and she finds herself with another guy. And oh, this poor woman, Usane aha isha acharon, and the latter fellow really hates her. Like Usneya, literally he hates her. He doesn't like her. It says this latter man rejects her. What does he do? V'chatav la sefer kritut. He does the exact same thing as hubby number one. He writes her a bill of divorcement, v'natam biyada, places it in her hand, v'shilacha mi beito. He sends her forth from his house. Oh, or ki yamuta isha acharon. This latter fellow dies. Asher l'kacha la liisha, the one who had taken her as a wife. The rule goes on. Lo yuchal bala rishon. The first husband who divorced her may not take her into his household to become his wife again. Since, what's the reason for this? So she can't go back to hubby number one. She has been defiled, meaning not necessarily ritually made impure, but she has become disqualified. And it even goes on to put a religious cast on this. It says, Ki toevat hi lifnei Adonai. This is a thing that is not done in God's sight. This is abhorrent to God, which is a category of defilement that also is used in describing idolatrous practice, that is also used in describing eating food that is rotting on the side of the road, like eating a carcass, non-kosher food, not necessarily because it's not a kosher animal, but because it's not slaughtered properly. That is also an abomination before God. Male homosexual intercourse is also an abomination before God. There are all sorts of things that the Bible categorizes as abominable. One of them is getting divorced twice and going back to your original husband and trying to cohabit with him again. They're saying, that's a taboo. There's a religious taboo against that in the book of Deuteronomy. Velo tachati et haaret. You must not bring sin upon the earth. Asher Adonai Elohecha noten lecha nachala, which God has given you as an inheritance. So, and it goes on from there. Read all of Deuteronomy chapter 24 if you're interested to learn more on the subject of biblical divorce. But clearly, the idea of a woman who gets divorced becoming a kind of outcast or second-class citizen in society on religious grounds, that this is a thing God doesn't like, is A, a known practice in biblical society, B, a practice with which the rabbinic discomfort will lead to evolutions in Jewish practice, namely the issuance of a get, which allows a woman to be divorced and to remarry without the stigma that the Bible would have assigned to her. So you can see the way in which rabbinic law is actually an evolution, and I believe it's a moral evolution from known biblical practice. When we pick up next week, we're going to go deep into the woods on divorce and aguna. We'll have some stories to share. We'll have some more text to read. But I wanted to just open up for any concluding comments or questions today, because this was a pretty intense session with a lot of very detailed points of Jewish law and practice. All right, Mom and Dad, you get a comment in.
What do you attribute the modern appeal of lay people conducting marital ceremonies? Universal Life Church, and and let's say Maura Rose from Schitt's Creek.
Oh God, right.
But where did all this come from, and why is this so popular?
It is becoming more and more popular for people, young people in particular, to ask a friend to solemnize their marriage vows. Most states permit this. New York, as of about 14 months ago, signed into law a bill that opens up and becomes much more lax around the authority of lay people to solemnize weddings in the state of New York. New York used to be one of the strictest states in terms of the requirements that were stipulated for the solemnizer. The person previously had to be either a duly ordained clergy person, a minister of the faith, I think is how the old law put it, or a duly recognized civil official like a justice of the peace. And either of those pathways was a legitimate way for a solemnizer to conduct a wedding in the state of New York. As of March 2024, New York signed into law a relaxing of that standard by allowing anyone who petitions the state who meets certain basic requirements of, like, I think you have to be a US citizen or something like that. But even an out-of-state officiant can petition New York State to be recognized as a solemnizer for a day without having to be ordained. Previous to March of 2024, people who were just Joe from the street who wanted to solemnize a friend's or a loved one's wedding but had no officially recognized ministry, who were not a minister of the faith, or who were not a legally recognized civil official, had to get an online certificate of, like, Universal Life Church Ministry, which basically was just a way, it was a racket. It was like, I think, 35 or $50 to basically sign a pledge online and get a certificate that says you're a minister of the faith. And I think the state correctly recognized that that was a sham. It was a sham industry, and I'm glad that that's over. I'm glad that you don't have to petition the state on the bogus grounds that you're suddenly an overnight minister. So I actually think that specific element of your question is beneficial. Look, I do a lot of weddings. I have a big congregation. We have a big congregation here. I'm full up. So, like, if somebody wants to take a couple of weddings off my plate by having a cousin or a friend marrying them, sei gesund. I just can't do them all. And even my team can't do them all. So that's fine. And I would say 3 or 4 times a year, I sit with a member of my community who says to me, Rabbi, I've been asked to do a wedding for my friend, cousin, my associate. My only qualifications are I know the couple and I'm a good public speaker. And I'm like, great. How much Judaism do they want? And then you view it as a creative opportunity to help that person do a wedding. So in my view, like, it actually facilitates an opening for me to have a good conversation with my congregants about Jewish weddings, and therefore deepens a relationship that I have with my congregation, even if I'm not the one standing under the chuppah. The fact of the matter is, though, rabbis and cantors tend to be pretty good at this just because we're really practiced. Like, if you want somebody who knows what they're doing, get somebody who knows what they're doing. Like, otherwise, I don't know, you've probably all been to weddings that are just beautiful and eloquent, and you've also been to weddings where you can't wait to have a drink. So for me, it's not so much about the title as it is about the what qualifies a person to do a good wedding may not be their state sanctioned title or authority given by the state. And I've told you already today, it's not the Jewish tradition. What gives a person the authority is they're not, I'm sorry, somebody is desperate to reach me and I'm trying to get them to stop it. What gives somebody the authority to marry is just their familiarity with the service. So, like, any lay person can be trained to do a wedding, but some are going to be better at it than others. Don't ask your friend to do a wedding if they're a lousy public speaker. That's my view. Well, my friends, the time has come for us to say fare thee well for today. I hope that you are still enjoying these spring showers and that they're bringing some flowers into your yard in your life. And I'll wish you an early Shabbat Shalom. I hope to see you before next week or next Thursday morning at the latest.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank
Kol
you.
hakavod.
Thanks. Bye-bye.